On one hand, such rewards-based programs can be defined very narrowly. That is a payments intervention where performance is strictly monitored, rewards are contingent on performance, and payments to beneficiaries are large enough to offset opportunity costs. A more rigorous or strict definition of payments for environmental services than what typically or what very often happens in reality. Uh, On the other hand, a very wide range of interventions which are not so strictly related to which do not conform to the strict definition of payments for environmental services can also be considered rewards-based. They may include informal payments for conserving environmental goods and services, community and user group-based resource conservation programs that provide users some benefits, often without performance contingencies or monitoring, and asset building efforts from development and sustainable development programs that seek to reduce the reliance of users on natural resources. The study whose results I'm going to talk about today was conducted in India beginning in 2005, so a long time ago. It examined the sustainable development intervention that tried to improve forest cover and material well-being of beneficiaries, and is an example of the way many development and environment programs function today. They seek to enhance environmental outcomes, to enhance sustainability, and at the same time to increase local incomes and material well-being. They also often assume that participation in the program will lead to an improvement in different program objectives, different program outcomes. The program in question is a watershed management program implemented in the state of Himachal Pradesh in northern India. The study itself is a joint effort with two of my colleagues, Ashwini Chhatre at the Indian School of Business and Elizabeth Gerber at the University of Michigan. The narrative arc of my presentation is as follows. Schematically speaking, there are three standard solutions to environmental problems. Privatization, regulation, and civil society / community. These three solutions have been around for a long time, and nearly as long as we have recognized that there are environmental problems. Decision and policymakers, donors, researchers, politicians, NGOs, in short, anyone interested in environmental enhancement or conservation, they place changing emphasis on these three alternative ways of achieving conservation. And these changes occur with changing fashions, changing intellectual emphases, and changing politics, not necessarily because of what we know about how effective they are. I had a long set of sort of description of these three different approaches, and I'm going to skip that just in the interest of time, and go to my next slide, which is on the main research question we have, so that we can get to the crux of the findings and also have some questions and answers with you. The one thing I would say is that to study this program, this Mid-Himalayan Watershed Program, which is the Sustainable Development Program, we used a quasi-experimental design, and our goal was to assess the extent to which the program had an impact on people's motivations, their actions, and forest conditions. So the study looked at all of these three things together, and the extent to which they change or changes in one of them are indicative of changes in the other two sets of outcomes as well. We also want to understand how different elements of the program, because it was a complex program with hundreds of different activities being implemented, how these different aspects or different activities in the program affected the things that we are interested in. So the main research question we asked was, do more benefits to households lead to more or less environmental protection? More specifically, we asked, how does participation in the Sustainable Development Program, which aims, among other things, to increase forest cover, affect the motivations and behaviors of those participating in the program compared to those who were not participating, and also how it affects the amount of biomass in these forests that are used by villagers in the treatment or the program villages compared to the forests of villages not included in the program. If we try to answer this question using just our intuition, there are two possible answers. One, which is the relatively more obvious or straightforward one, is that higher benefits and rewards to households are likely to strengthen their interest in environmental conservation and lead to enhanced environmental motivations and actions for conservation, leading to better forest conditions. This is the standard sort of assumption of most efforts at paying people or providing them rewards. And if this was the answer, I should just walk away right now because there's no point in giving the rest of the talk. However, a second possibility is that these higher incentives displace environmental motivations and lead people to associate environmental protection with receiving material rewards. And that when these incentives are removed, people go back to doing just what they did before. If that is the answer, that's really unfortunate and undermines a lot of work that we are now seeing focusing on rewards and payments for promoting environmental conservation. Just as intuition gives us these two different stories or these two different answers, we have very similar kinds of responses from existing theoretical work on incentives and behavior, or incentives and motivations. And if you think about these relevant different theoretical streams of research, the first or the more familiar one, the standard economic rational choice theories, would suggest that if households receive higher rewards and benefits, then one should see more people willing to act to protect the environment, and people becoming more motivated to protect the environment. However, there's a second set of theories, which are typically referred to as motivational crowding theories, which suggest that a different set of outcomes is possible. And to understand why a different set of outcomes is possible, it's important to distinguish between the kinds of motivations people have for doing whatever they do, the kinds of motivations that you have or I have for doing what we do. And the two sets of motivations to be distinguished are intrinsic and extrinsic motivations. Although people in general have both intrinsic and extrinsic motivations, and both of them are relevant when they are carrying out actions, for certain kinds of actions, for certain kind of motivations, it's really important to pay attention to intrinsic motivations. And the theorists who talk about motivational crowding suggests that for pro-social or for environmental actions, which are a subcategory of pro-social actions or motivations, it's very important to pay attention to intrinsic motivations because people often undertake environmental actions because they want to, because they care about the environment, not because they're being paid to do so. So when it comes to understanding the effects of changes of incentives on motivations and behavior, it is critically important to understand how incentives and rewards affect the balance between intrinsic and extrinsic motivations for doing what people do. Additionally, the prediction from motivational crowding theories about incentives to households would be that the results depend on how incentives affect these two different motivations. Under some conditions, providing material incentives for pro-social actions may crowd out intrinsic motivation for undertaking environmental actions. And some kinds of rewards, on the other hand, may have the effect of crowding in motivations, crowding in environmental motivations. And the degree of crowding in or crowding out is not predetermined based on the magnitude of the incentives or the amounts of reward. It is dependent on the type and framing of rewards as well. So with this background and framing, I turn to our study area, which is Himachal Pradesh, and the colored districts in this slide are the ones where the first phase of the program was implemented. The Mid-Himalayan Watershed Program began implementation in 2006, and its first tranche of funding was about $230 million from the World Bank, and this money went to the state government's forest department, which was the implementing agency or the agency in charge of implementing the program. Himachal Pradesh is a beautiful setting, almost as beautiful as Cartagena, but there's no stretch of water from outside your street in your viewing area. I want to provide a small introduction to the key features of the state as also of the project before describing our approach and our findings. Himachal Pradesh is a relatively small state, especially for India. It is small both in area and population. The population density is very high. A lot of the area of the state cannot be used for agriculture, so it is especially high when you look at the amount of arable land available for agriculture. Agriculture is highly reliant, it's the main occupation, and highly reliant on forests for nutrients, for providing different kinds of benefits, especially fodder and firewood to households. And the civil society in the state has a reputation of being both strong and also has a reputation of high levels and rising levels of environmental awareness. The program itself, in the first phase, covered about 800 forest councils. Each council comprises 3 to 5 villages, 150 to 250 households, and altogether it was implemented in 2,500 households. The program was considered a great success. In 2014, the second phase of the program began with almost double the amount of funding, and it is now operational in the entire state of Himachal Pradesh. Same structure, same implementation process, etc. So what did the program do? As I said, it did many things. It tried to implement a whole series of different activities, and when we were looking at them, it became very difficult to understand what each individual activity, what was the effect of each of these individual activities on the 3 outcomes in which we are interested: people's motivations, behavior, and forest cover. So what we did was to try to identify some common elements among these activities, and we settled upon 3 of them. The program implemented a lot of information and awareness building activities. So there were meetings, there were face-to-face discussions, focus group discussions, distribution of pamphlets, distribution of material about the program, all intended to achieve 2 things. One, to convince people that protecting the environment, protecting forests is a good thing. And second, to describe to them what the program was going to do and how it was going to engage people and households in these villages to protect forests. So that was the first set of activities that were implemented, and we call them the information mechanism, or the information and awareness activities. The second set of activities focused on providing people small amounts of livelihood benefits, private benefits. So these benefits were intended to steer people away from using forests by creating new kinds of employment opportunities, by creating new kinds of economic activities in these villages. So people were given seeds and fertilizers and chickens and small cattle and sheep and stuff. And the idea was that by relying on these new activities, people would use less of the forest. And then the third set of activities, and we call them the private benefit mechanism or the livelihood mechanism. And then the third set of activities were essentially to repair local infrastructure, the footpaths, the irrigation channels, the water tanks, cattle watering tanks, and we call them collective mechanism or collective benefits mechanism. So our goal then became, in addition to understanding how the program affected these different outcomes in which you're interested, it also became how to assess the effects of these 3 different mechanisms, and also the extent to which these mechanisms, there were spillovers among them, or they had independent effects, whether joint effects or independent effects on the outcomes in which we are interested. We can essentially think of these activities as 3 different mechanisms through which the program sought to achieve its aim, and so our research essentially tried to examine both of these. Our research started in 2005, as I said. I was actually visiting Himachal Pradesh for a different research project, and I learned about the Mid-Himalayan Watershed Program, which was going to be implemented starting next year. So, we had been thinking about starting a new project, and we felt that if we could identify where this project was going to be implemented, then we could identify some places where it was not, and we could have a really nice research design where we look at some control cases matched to the treatment cases, and then look at collect some baseline data before the program starts implementation, and then go back and collect a second round of data. And that's what we did. The Forest Department was actually very cooperative it gave us the full list of all the village councils where the program was going to be implemented, all 2,500 of them. So we selected 5 of them, and then we selected another 5 as a matched pair of control councils, and we collected baseline data on about 2,200 households in 30 villages in these 10 different forest village councils. We went back in 2011 and we collected data again on the same households. The response rate was very high, roughly around 98%, but a lot of households in the meanwhile had divided, and one set of panchayats, village councils that we had selected, turned out to actually not be very similar when we looked at the more detailed baseline data. So we dropped them, and so in the second round we collected data on 1,600 households on which we had collected data in 2005. The information we gathered was on a whole variety of things, on motivations and behavior, of course, but a whole range of issues around the extent and the nature of people's participation in the project, a range of covariates on social, economic, demographic variables, activities in forests, blah, blah, blah. So just to see the extent to which we could ensure that when we carried out analysis, we could match different participants to each other. To assess environmental motivations of people that we were talking with and that we were doing surveys with, we asked them the question, if forests are to be protected, what's the most important reason to protect them? Is it economic or environmental? And the first time we asked this question, nearly everybody said both. So we went back and we forced them to pick one. Because we wanted to understand whether the economic or environmental motivations dominated. And one possible response to that might be, well, people just picked something at random. So we'll see the extent to which there's randomness in these responses. We did the same thing in 2011. When you look at the data, just the raw data and the distribution of what people said in 2006 versus 11, this table is more or less self-explanatory, but to take the first red percentage, 186 respondents, these are people who in 2006 said protect forests for economic reasons, and in 2011 switched to environmental. The first cell is 223 people who said economic and economic in both rounds of data collection. And if you look at the red proportion numbers, you'll see that in the treatment villages, the respondents are more likely to switch from saying economic to environmental, less likely to say switch from economic to environmental compared to the control villages. And they're also less likely to stick to environmental motivations as being the reason to protect forests compared to those in the control villages. We did some additional analysis looking at trying to match different households in our treatment versus control villages, and essentially we found very consistent results from the matching, which is that there was roughly about a 10 to 12%, 15% decline in people's motivations from saying protect forests for environmental reasons to saying protect them for economic reasons. So the people essentially switched about 12% more likely if they were in the treatment villages to switch from saying environmental to saying economic. And so that's a negative sign in these results. We also looked at the effects of these different mechanisms, and what this graph shows you is how the 3 different mechanisms I talked about, the information, the private benefits, and the collective mechanism, what effect it had on people's motivations. That is switching from environmental to economic. And so these 3 clusters of graphs, if you look at the first one, that one has 3 different bars. The first bar indicates what was the effect of the information mechanism, essentially people who received information from the project. They were about 14-15% more likely to change from saying protect forests for environmental reasons to begin to say protect them for economic reasons. A somewhat similar answer, somewhat similar pattern for private benefits. And then people who received collective benefits, they were more likely to switch from economic to environmental. And so that's the darker bar above the 0 line. And the 3 different clusters of bar represent 3 different comparison groups or 3 different control groups that we looked at. The first control group was only residents in the non-project or in the control villages. The second control group were all the people in the project villages that did not participate in the project. And the third set of control group respondents are all the households, either in the project or in the control villages that did not participate in the project. And the response pattern is very similar across these three different control groups. We finally also looked at the responses of people who received either only one kind of treatment or two kinds of treatments together, or all the three different mechanisms. And so I'll only go through the very last and the very first cluster of bars here. The information mechanism, which is essentially through meetings, people had the greatest effect in making people switch from environmental to saying economic to protect forests. And the collective mechanism had the highest effect in terms of people switching their stated preference or stated motivation from economic to environmental. And the last two bars essentially show that if people received all these three treatments or all these three mechanisms or none of them, essentially the results were the same. It's as if people's motivations would have remained utterly the same if the project had not existed. So what do these results suggest? One, that it is important to distinguish between intrinsic and extrinsic motivations. We also see that these different mechanisms activate motivations. Meetings have a negative effect, private benefits have little or no effect, and collective benefits have a positive effect. Treated together, people who received private benefits, which includes among them people who also received collective and information benefits, had a small effect, sort of small negative effect. People who received collective benefits had a very strong positive effect, and those who received only information benefits together with others had a negative effect. So, motivations are great to understand and to distinguish intrinsic versus extrinsic motivations. Are they associated with changes in behavior? Because we are all real world people, we care about behavior, we care about actions. So let's look at what happened to actions. We looked at two kinds of actions, two kinds of behaviors. Political participation, because I'm a political scientist and trained as one, so I can't do any research without at least some element of politics in it. And we also looked at conservation actions, which may be of more interest to you. So to examine effects on behavior, we looked at program level effects, essentially, and looked at how these two different kinds of behaviors, one political participation and one conservation behavior, changed. For political participation, we looked at two different indicators. One, number of days people spent campaigning in local council elections, village council elections. And the second, number of days people spent in attending meetings of these councils, the village-wide meetings of these councils. And these two different forms of participation are different from each other in that when you're campaigning for your candidate, your expectation is that if your candidate wins, you get something in return from them. So this is kind of a zero-sum game. If you want your candidate to win, there's a lot of competition, very high levels of political participation in terms of people voting. So this is essentially an example of an indicator where if you participate and you win, you get lots of benefits. If you lose, you get nothing. And the second kind of participation or political participation has an emphasis on collaboration, where you go to the meeting, you talk to those who have been elected, even if they are not your candidates or not your party, you can expect to get something if you make enough noise. And we might be familiar with this from faculty meetings, etc. So we looked at both of these kinds of outcomes, and then we also looked at conservation outcomes, but let me first describe the results of these two sets of outcomes. And the main result is that households in project villages and treatment villages campaigned fewer days. They went out and tried to do something for their candidate less amount of time. They attended fewer meetings as well. So basically participation declined in the treatment villages, both for campaigning and for participation in the village council meetings when we compare individuals in the project villages with individuals in the control villages. But when we compare individuals in the project villages with those who did not participate in the project but were in the project villages, we see a slightly different pattern. Electoral campaigning's amount of time spent electoral campaigning still declined, but the amount of time in meetings went up. And this is the average treatment effect of these different comparison groups. We see some positive response from project participants compared to non-project participants in the same village when it comes to participation in the village council meetings. What about conservation behavior? I'll describe very briefly the results that we have, and they essentially suggest that the change in behavior is very consistent with changes in motivations. We looked at 4 different indicators of energy use and 4 different indicators of fodder use, the 2 main benefits from forests that people derive. And they are essentially in the nature of the extent to which people switched from using firewood to using LPG or gas, liquid petroleum gas, the extent to which people stopped using forests altogether for firewood, the extent to which the amount of fuel wood that they used from forests went down, etc. And the same thing for livestock practices, the amount of time spent grazing in the forest by the animals, the amount of fodder extracted, etc. Switching from fodder in the forest to stall-fed feeding of animals. And we find essentially that for all of them, the signs are indicative of conservational crowding. That is to say, people who participated in the project and were in the project villages increased their consumption of benefits from the forest compared to those in the control villages. People who they either increased their benefits or they started using more forest benefits, more fodder, more firewood. What about the condition of natural resources? And that's really probably the thing that we are most interested in. And so remember, I said that we had 4 pairs of treatment and control councils, and we looked at forest condition in them by focusing on the mean basal area of trees in those forests. We looked at that in 2006, and we looked at that in 2011. And the next, I'll report the results of 2 of these pairs of councils because the pattern is essentially just the same for the other 2 as well. And the main result is that the forest conditions improved in the control panchayats, went down in the treatment panchayats, treatment councils. The first 2 bars here indicate the change in basal area in the control councils based on about 108 forest plots, and the second 2 bars indicate change in the basal area in the treatment councils. And this is the first pair of village councils, and this is the second pair of village councils. And as you can see, the effects they look very much the same in both of them. That brings a close to our findings from this research. What are some of? So I would probably make 3. I would indicate 3 caveats or 3 qualifiers to our results. One, this is a quasi-experimental research design. It's not randomization of the treatment. That is of the places where the councils became project versus non-project councils. We tried our best to select councils that were matched to the treatment councils, and we also did a matching-based analysis to look at whether the households are as similar to the households in the control councils as possible. But there might be unobservables which we have not taken. There might be unobservables which we have not taken into account. Second thing I should say is, remember I said we imposed a classification on the different activities that the program implemented. There's the treatment of the implementation of these activities is highly heterogeneous. There may be selection bias among the participants who decided to take part in the village in this program. We cannot control for that. And finally, there might be a whole range of mediating conditions that structure the effects of these program implementation, and we haven't taken those into account. So having made these qualifications, I want to summarize the results. One, there is conditional crowding out of motivations, particularly from economic and environmental benefits, informational benefits. There's a crowding out of conservation behavior. There's a degradation of local forests. And so all of these 3 in the project villages or the treatment villages compared to the control villages. There's also a demobilization of electoral activities, which I think political scientists might find interesting. There is crowding in of motivations with collective benefits, through the collective mechanism. And finally, there's some mobilization of direct democracy participation in the villages where the project was implemented compared to non-participants in those same villages. I don't want to spend too much time on the broader implications of this. It's always dangerous to generalize from one case study to a larger context. But I do want to say that at the very least, these findings suggest that we should distinguish between intrinsic and extrinsic motivations when it comes to payments-based programs to improve environmental outcomes and environmental conservation. And if we don't do so, we run the risk either of not really achieving the most we can with the scarce funds that are being spent on conservation, or even perhaps of getting outcomes that we would really like not to have gotten. Thank you very much. Should I?
We do have time. Yes, okay. We have time for questions from the public side. Or if you want to take it, please go ahead.
Yeah, please. I don't know most people's names here, so please say your name and introduce yourself to the rest of the participants, and I'll be happy to try to answer your questions. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for a very interesting case study. I found it very interesting with the intrinsic motivation, and I have two questions on that.
I am completely ineffective, but if you'd say your name, other people will know who you are.
I'm tired. Volker Mauhofer, University of Vienna in Austria. Two short questions. The one is, in how far would be information or more funding for information supporting this intrinsic motivation and make people do things or support people which do things anyway, yeah? So in how far would be spending more money on this information providing and be perhaps more effective than providing economic incentives, yeah? So, and the second question would be just a methodology question. In how far was the participation in the meetings obligatory and in your study? Thank you.
Shivan, is the pattern to collect a lot of questions and then answer them, or? Why don't we get some more questions, then I can try to answer several of them together. Yeah? Please.
Hello. David Keith, University of New South Wales in Australia. My question is, I know you said that this is just one study, but I wondered if you had a hypothesis how this qualitative result might vary with the economic status of the community.
Also someone right at the back, gentleman with white hair, maroon shirt, if you can go next to him. Yeah, please go ahead.
Hi, Mary Blair, American Museum of Natural History in New York. I was wondering if the control villages were aware that the project was going on and if they had any feelings of missing out on benefits.
Right at the back. And then there's one person here. I'll take maybe 2 or 3 more questions and then try to answer what I can.
Yeah, thank you, Arun. I'm Eric Sanderson from the Wildlife Conservation Society. And I was wondering about rural to urban migration during the project period and whether that differed between your project and control treatments.
There's a question here too. Maybe after that one.
Abigail Dan from the University of British Columbia. I was just wondering if you thought that there might have been a difference in the initial responses to your question about motivations if you had used a randomized response technique if you thought that maybe that question was sensitive enough in their cultural context that people may not have been entirely honest about whether they prioritized environmental or economic motivations from the get-go.
Okay.
Hi, Rebecca Sterneman from Forest and Bird. I was just wondering how your results affected the World Bank as a donor, and if they actually responded or altered their methodology in any way, or if it's just gone into scientific papers.
There's one question here as well. Do you want to just ask a question? I'll repeat it.
Sure. And know that it was an intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation question. And then also, what was going on in these meetings? Did you participate in the meetings? Because it seems to me that you would expect to see that those who were getting the economic benefits would be the ones who would be shifting, whereas in the meetings they would be more talking about the other kinds of benefits. So what exactly was happening in those meetings?
Maybe one last question, and then I'll try to. There's a gentleman here.
Edward Pindozan, Cardiff University. I was just wondering, thank you for your talk. I was just wondering, to what extent do you think we're doing enough to employ evaluation techniques in conservation biology? Because it sounds that was a strong message there.
Okay, thank you very much for these questions. I don't know the answers to all of them, but I'll try to answer those that I do have something to say about, even if I don't know the answer. So the first question was, to what extent can we get better returns from information, increased information and awareness efforts compared to providing more economic benefits, and the extent to which participation in this program was obligatory in the meetings and the information treatment especially. So I am not sure, and I think the results of my research should be taken with a little, they're not definitive in the sense all these three treatments are implemented at the same time. It's not as if people were selected and said, you are going to get only information, you're going to get only private benefits, etc. What I can say is that what I can say on the basis of our research is that if you implement an information treatment and an economic benefits treatment at the same time, and there are some people who get just information, they still see everybody else who's getting economic benefits for doing essentially the same thing. And I think there is a lot of experimental work in behavioral economics, in experimental economics, that suggests that that is a very bad situation for promoting whatever goal you have. That information essentially has a very negative effect on people who are selected into that treatment when people can also see others who are getting an economic benefit. Participation in meetings was not obligatory in the sense that the government said, or the forest department said, if you don't come to the meeting, we're going to put you in jail, or if you're going to fine you 5,000 rupees. Essentially what it said is that it worked through the village council. It said to people, this is an important program, you should come to the meeting, and many people did. Not everybody did. The second question was, damn, I can't understand my own handwriting. It was from University of New South Wales in Australia. Why something varies. Yes, please. Thank you. Yeah, okay, yes, yes. So we did look at what were the changes in the economic conditions, because remember we collected a lot of data on socioeconomic conditions of respondents, and we looked at what were the changes in the economic conditions, especially among treatment and non-treatment cases, and also change from 2006 to 11. And we didn't look for how the results may vary depending on changes in economic conditions, but one indicative answer to your question is that both the difference between treatment and our control cases, both including those who participated versus did not participate in the treatment councils, and the change between 2006 and 11 were this very, very simple, not statistically significantly different between these two sets of cases. So one of the questions I've gotten is maybe the results are because those in the treatment villages became better off. First of all, that should actually, the standard hypothesis about people becoming better off is that they become more environmentally conscious. So the results kind of would not support that, but that's why we looked at this issue, and we don't find that there's a difference between them. Eric's question about rural to urban migration, very similar patterns between these two sets of villages and between our different sets of respondents. So I should say this is a hill economy in South Asia. The hill economy is also known as the remittance economy. Very high levels of rural to urban migration and migration from the state to even outside of India. But I think more importantly for this study, the differences are not very significant between our treatment and control cases. Abigail's question about would the motivations have been different had we used a randomized response technique. I must learn from you about what the randomized response technique is. I'm not sure. I don't know what the answer to that question is. I think Rebecca's question was, did the World Bank change anything? I'm sorry for myself that it didn't. I feel, this is not entirely unexpected, right? We do a lot of research. A lot of us have hopes that our research will have an impact. A few of us are fortunate that it does. Sometimes we wish it didn't when it does. But, I think people in the bank and people in funding agencies and people in government agencies and researchers live in different worlds, and many of us make really valiant efforts to make bridges across these two worlds, and we should try more. I should have tried more. What we did was we didn't really make any concerted effort to engage with the World Bank. We sent the results of our work when we first came up with them, and then we sent the initial document that we prepared, and then the final paper that came out on motivations. We haven't really published the research of the effects on behavior and the effects on forests yet, to which we got a polite note thanking us and saying we should look them up when we come to Washington, D.C. But we didn't really, as I said, the program has now been expanded. It's now double its size, covers the entire state, and the implementation process is just the same. I think it says something about, it gives us some clues about why there are these different worlds. I think research by itself changes very little. Sometimes it does, but very, very, very seldom. And when it does so in the longer run, not immediately. Lauren, you asked some really interesting questions. How did we frame our question about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation? I think you point to a really important issue that we essentially assume that environmental motivations are intrinsic motivations. And so how did this research get framed the way it did? We went in thinking those who participate more should get more motivated to engage with the forests and to reduce their consumption. So the results were a total surprise to us. We had literally didn't know what to do with these results. We wrote back to our field manager, to the field research manager. We looked at the coding to see if we had, by mistake, entered the wrong signs, because it was so, and everything was, none of the alternative explanations for mistakes we might have made in coding or in analysis were true. So this dirty secret about our research, we superimposed the intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation theories because it just seemed so apt to explain what we found. And which is also one reason why I'm suspicious of, not suspicious, I don't believe, it's very self-serving. I don't believe in the idea that you should declare the results of what you expect to find, and if you don't find what you expected to, throw out your research. I don't think it is meaningful or reasonable. A lot of what we have, penicillin, for example, would not exist if that were the protocol for doing good research. So this was a post hoc framing of what we found. I think you are right to question whether intrinsic motivations are necessarily environmental motivations, but that's the way we have framed them, and now you know. The second question you asked was what was going on in the meetings. We did attend some meetings, and as you might expect from meetings held in dim light in rural areas in poor parts of India, a lot was going on. I mean, people were, we attended 3 meetings, and they ranged from being very civil and cordial to being very confrontational. The meetings were run by the forest department. There was a representative from the village council present. One thing I could say is that they were all very animated. People wanted to know about what was going on. From the meetings, I could not make out whether people who received economic benefits were also participating or not participating in the meetings. There are a lot of people there, and I didn't know any of them. So, also, which is why all we have is where people, our information treatment compresses a lot of different things. It compresses whether people received pamphlets, where people had face-to-face meetings, whether they were individual one-on-one meetings, or whether they participated in these group meetings and so forth. So it's a very noisy measure, I would say. The problem is that the program represented 200 different activities. So if we look at each individual one of them, we don't see anything. Because nothing is happening from the program. But the program as a whole had a big, clear, consistent, strong effect, statistically significant. So, we went as far, I think, as we could in identifying something that is conceptually meaningful and interesting from the set of activities that was actually implemented. But, yeah. Edward, are we doing enough to employ techniques? Evaluation techniques. I don't work with evaluation techniques, so my answer is probably no, but I don't know. So I don't know. I'd imagine not. Yeah, I'm pretty sure you're not. But sorry, I don't know. I think we are out of time. Shimena? Yeah? Thank you so much. It's such a joy and pleasure to talk to you.